Hello, everyone. Books with Banks back again, and I'm so grateful to once again be joined by Stephen Erikson. Thank you for being here, Steve. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. So, uh, for those of you watching, I mentioned right before we came on that, or right before I started recording, that in this most recent time that I'm going through Erikson's or your Malazan Book of the Fallen series, I've been noticing, or I've been paying more attention to just the different ways that you play around with death, the afterlife, gods of death, these sorts of things. And it's sort of a strange happy holidays season kind of time of year to talk about such a dark topic. But I just couldn't resist sending the invite to see if you'd like to have this conversation. So
Sure,
really, again,
sure.
thanks for joining me. Yeah.
No, I don't see it as a dark topic at all. After all, we are heading for a season for whom a lot of people are kind of exercising those notions of resurrection, anyways, coming. So um, it's very much, I think, a cultural characteristic here in the West that death is viewed as something abnormal, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
So no, it's I think it's entirely appropriate.
Okay. Okay. Great. I get before we get too far, I should say massive, huge spoiler warning for everything
Yeah.
Malazan. We'll be talking about characters who die, revealing their fates, maybe some characters who come back, things like that. So if you're reading the series for the first time, and you're concerned about those spoilers, uh, thanks for watching up to this point. But please check this video out maybe once you're a little further along. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, so I guess maybe to start, instead of a specific scene, I get with fantasy, so many different fantasy series and stories have their own pantheon of gods, and you get to play around with something like kind of your own creation, your own god of death, that being Hood in this world. So I'm
Hmm.
just kind of curious what the backstory is on creating that character? Was he part of the gaming? Was he just a swear word, or like was yeah? I'm just really curious about how the god how an author makes a god of death.
Yeah. I think one needs to be sort of reminded that uh, epic fantasy is where literature begins historically. And so if you look back on some of the very early epic tales that were recorded, um, a whole lot of them have a lot to do with death, right? So Gilgamesh is a great example. The Egyptian mythologies and Osiris and Isis and all that kind of stuff. Greek mythology. That notion of crossing that divide between the living and the dead is a central component to so many of our early mythologies and or stories. Um, I would think primarily because it's addressing the one question that can never be answered. At least when it's answered, it is with finality, and it's something that we cannot, you know, thereafter share with the living. So it's an element of mystery that is always present um, in those early stories. So if you're going to be sort of uh, building on the traditions and the heritage of epic literature, uh, why would you ignore that? Why would you not be part of that exploration? I mean, it's so central to the human condition. It would be strange not to. And to me, it would strike me as strange to impose a kind of a modern mechanistic sensibility upon that fantasy world. Again, that wouldn't even make sense to me that much. So,
So Was Hood in the games or referenced when you
I
and
think so.
naming? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think we created a pantheon. Bearing in mind, we never sort of answered the question of whether the pantheon is simply um, categories or personifications of a single entity or not, right?
Sure.
Um, but once we create the pantheon, then as gamers, but also as writers, we're then it's like an open invitation to attribute some kind of personality trait or a series of traits onto that entity. So that's where the question of almost that cliched notion of death as um, an ultra serious, frightening, or demonic, or evil, if you will, kind of personification just did not make that much sense. It was too easy to go in that direction. I mean, that fear of death is what's being personified if you create a god of death in that fashion, as something to be feared, as something to run from, or whatever. So once that's sort of opening things up in terms of the personality, then it becomes a lot more fun. You can play around with it, and the Malazan stuff's not unique in that. I think I've not read Terry Pratchett, but my understanding is his personification of death is a lot of fun. So
I've only read
I could
one
be
of
wrong. I
the
don't know.
death ones, but yeah, a ton of fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
sort of takes himself seriously, but yeah.
Well, does Hood take himself seriously? No. I mean, he's Jagut, so no.
Right, right. I
Yeah.
would you say he took himself more seriously back in Kharkanas days, versus where we find him in Book of the Fallen?
Well, I can't give away too much
Oh, sure.
because, yeah, the manifestation of Hood as the god of death. I guess. I mean, it's not a secret, but I mean that's going to be um, fairly central to um, the Walk in Shadow novel. So.
That is sort of part of probably why this was on my mind too, because like a little more than a year ago when I started making videos, it was so much about the prequels,
Hmm.
and I was thinking about Hood and waging a war against death in that series, um, and yeah, and but then this video and just going back through Malazan Book of the Fallen, it's kind of like, oh, here's a way to talk about death that maybe people who haven't read the prequels yet, maybe they can
Hmm.
also enjoy this as well.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I'm sure it evolved over the 10-book series as well. And so it acquired, more elaboration as time went on, and I got more comfortable with the role that character would play. Um, Having said that, though, I mean, I can think even in the third book we have Hood uh, personally intervening in at least one death.
Yeah, sure.
Um, so that set the precedent for uh, those those later interventions in the later books. Um, so wherever I had a sense where I guess even the god of death would be in some fashion either impressed or impacted emotionally by the death of a mortal, to then make a physical appearance as an act of honor, if you will, struck me as kind of a cool thing. So.
Yeah. All right. All right. Um, so there was one moment in House of Chains that funny or hilarious. Those might not be the right words, but it's the famous scene where Bidethal gets uh,
Mhm.
his due. He gets what's coming to him,
Yeah.
and everyone talks about how kind of I don't know, perfectly over the top, or like how it perfectly matches uh, his crimes
Hmm.
and what Karsa does in that scene. But then this time I hadn't really remembered this part of the whole sequence, but when he gets to to Hood's realm, or whatever, I believe, uh, it's like there's a bunch of demons waiting there to torment him, and I don't know why, but when I read that, I just saw Hood like kind of saying, "No, you stand here and you stand here, and this is what you're gonna
Yeah,
do when he gets here, and this is what you're gonna do," because his suffering's not over. Like it's
it's
not
not
just
over.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, I don't remember much about that, but I guess I threw that scene in just to sort of indicate that, um, yeah, there are consequences that go beyond the mortal realm, if you will. Um, Whether that in any way conveys my own personal beliefs on that is a whole different matter. But for the purposes of the Malazan universe, that seemed quite fitting.
Uh, and then maybe sticking with House of Chains, there's a lot at the end of that book, about the spirits kind of around Raraku, and the Holy Desert, and them sort of getting to come back and fight again, and how Gamut's death flows nicely, I guess,
Hmm.
neatly into that. And I guess I'm curious to hear your take on Gamut and how, uh, just his whole character building up to him dying. Did you know that that's where he
I'm
was
not
ultimately going
sure.
to go?
I would say at some point in that narrative, with his point of view, I realized that he was the ideal bridge across, from the living, to the dead. Um, and then of course you set up the scene so that it that movement from one to the other is integral to the actual action that's being portrayed in the scene. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since I thought about Gamut.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of House of Chains, was intended to uh, subvert, um, the reader expectations on the basis of the first three books, because I realized that I couldn't keep upping the ante, after Memories of Ice. And so I needed to go in the opposite direction. And so that's where the idea of, the retribution of the dead, became a way in which to, in some ways, take care of all that big battle stuff, and not have to worry too much about it, um, because the focus is entirely on two individuals. And so that's, where, by the end of Memories of Ice, we're talking, tens of thousands, of individuals. And, you know, the option would have been, okay, you go from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and hundreds of thousands to millions. And at a certain point, those numbers, cease to have any impact, right? It's just something we cannot comprehend in those kind of
Right.
numbers. And that struck me as the wrong direction. That was take us in a direction that, removed the poignancy of death. So House of Chains is very much structured to pull us back onto that, very personal level. Um, and that, some readers hated that, so, it was just, it's the way it goes. But I knew what I was up to in any case. And I
For
knew
sure.
I would lose, I would piss off some readers for sure.
So I guess also kind of tied in with, the uh, the dead kind of coming back. There's all of this foreshadowing throughout that book. Um, and again, I guess, or maybe not again, but I should apologize. Did House of Chains come out in 2002, 2003 or something? So I'm
You're
asking you
asking
to
me? I don't remember.
cast your mind back that far. But
Yeah.
I throughout that whole book, there's all of this stuff about, the Tano Spirit Walker song for the Bridge Burners,
Hmm.
and how they also kind of come back at the end. Some living like Quick Ben, but also Hedge makes a brief appearance with Fiddler there. Um, and yeah, I think, trying to turn this into a question. So on like, oh, what's your least favorite tropes in fantasy, or what's whatever, these kind of lists on YouTube, a lot of people say, oh, people coming back to life, or people being reincarnated, things like this.
Mhm.
um I guess I'm curious, like, if you've ever had a personal like preference in the stories you read when characters died and then came back, and I'm curious how you went about writing.
Yeah, a lot of traditional post-Tolkien epic fantasy um, did not. It's hard to explain, but there's a kind of bait and switch going on regarding death, and so it's ironic that people would complain about the resurrection of certain characters, because epic fantasy has been playing that game for a long time,
Mhm.
but they do it in a different way, and they do it by the um, the death of an historical character who is then reincarnated or re-embodied and reborn as as the main character of the story, usually as a child or whatever. So in that respect, in all of those stories, death is no longer a final element to the narrative. In fact, it's a launching point for those narratives. So that's one way to sort of, if you will, in story terms, to cheat that death. So it's the High King is reborn, or somebody who died and comes around again. The wheel turns, and they're back,
Uh-huh.
right? I
Uh-huh.
mean, that is as common as one can imagine. So I do find it quite ironic that people should have any issues with what I was doing. But
Yep.
I always thought of that stuff as a kind of a sort of a lazy take on it. Because if you are simply um, creating your backstory with your history of somebody rising and falling, having done great heroic deeds, and then whose spirit is reincarnated and reincorporated into the living world in a child who then discovers their legacy and their heritage. That's all very heroic, but none of it's earned, right? The child is simply born with this thing. Um, and so for those narratives, part of the entertainment is the revelations of who they are, and how that affects them as they're growing up. But it's also quite deterministic, isn't it? Because it means they're going to repeat,
Right.
in some fashion, what occurred before. So for the Malazan world, the idea of returning from death was going to be traumatic, absolutely traumatic. And that the individual who returns will be a fundamentally changed person on the basis as a consequence of having died. Um, so yeah, there wasn't going to be any easy way out on that. If they were coming back, they were going to come back wounded and damaged in many, many ways. So
That, I mean, leads kind of perfectly into, just the other day I got to the scene in the fifth book where uh, uh, Udines, whatever.
Udina,
Sorry, the
yeah.
pronunciation. Okay. Where he does the wax and the coins and everything on
Mhm.
Roulette, and then Roulette wakes up and he's consoling him, and everything there. So yeah, when you're talking about the trauma that kind of needs to come with, or that would probably likely stick with someone after they come back to life, he
Yeah,
jumps to mind right away.
yeah, and roulette was kind of the metaphor made real in that one, right? Like it's very compact, but that kind of stuff has been going on throughout the books, right? But this was an instance where I could really sort of nail down that the thesis of returning from the dead being traumatic was going to be right there in one person, and we'd be able to follow them. Yeah.
I love not only just him, but or not only Roulette, but his the sort of circle, the community, tight community around him that is so like devastated and tragically impacted by like what he's going through,
Yeah,
fear
yeah,
and all of them. I just love seeing how they have to keep
yeah,
living with this over and over
yeah.
again.
Well, think of the horror genre and how much of the horror genre involves somebody returning from the dead,
Right, right.
right? It's pretty much almost a universal fear. There are medieval era burials in Europe that were, where they're accidentally exposed, and you're discovering that the body has been, sealed under a huge rock, or an iron spike has been driven through it to hold it in place. So that fear of the return of the dead um, is sort of a deeply entrenched one in many cultures, in many societies, and the horror genre certainly is a good example of that. It uses that a lot. Um, and so, if you're going to tie sort of horror and fear, or terror, if you will, to the return of the dead, I mean, that poses questions. Why? Why would that be a cause for fear of someone returning from the dead? Um, I guess in one respect, because it breaks all the rules of our expectations of how the universe works,
Hmm.
um, partly. But there's a weird, it's almost as if the living are to blame for the dead. And so that fear is one of retribution or revenge. Peter Straub's fantastic novel, Ghost Story, is a brilliant example of that. Um, if you haven't read the novel, that's
Never.
fine. See the film.
Oh,
The film with John Houseman and I think it might even be Fred Astaire. There's a whole bunch of veteran actors.
okay.
But it is a fantastic film, and it is about the dead reaping vengeance upon the living. And so I mean, it's, he sort of nails it right there. But that is present throughout, the horror genre. Vampires are just sort of an extension of that idea.
Hmm.
Um, so so if that's sort of part of our culture, then what about a culture that's quite different, that views its attitudes towards their ancestors in a very different way? Um, and so that's what gets really broken down among the Tiste when Roulade returns, because the ritual is sort of symbolically representing the lost wealth of somebody who's died. Their wisdom or their potential, whatever, has been lost, and so that's why the coins are attached. This is now going to sort of this wealth is leaving circulation, if you will. Um, and so then when it all breaks down, then yeah, the individuals within that group then are all completely traumatized by his return, and that kind of made sense to me. But it's certainly, maybe it emphasizes or highlights just how truncated and narrow our approach is regarding the dead here in the West. Um, I mean, there's some of the earliest cities that have been excavated. Um, the the ancestors were under the floor, or they were built into the threshold of the doorway, or in the walls of the buildings. So that's a very different sensibility regarding those people who, in your family who have died. You don't hide them away in a sense of going up to a hill and digging a pit and throwing the body in. No, you keep them present. Um, that's an interesting sensibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of on that point, something that Onrak reminded me of, or that kind of made me think about. He was talking with Troll Sengar in the fourth book, and he was explaining how I think he was explaining. He might have just been. I think he was actually talking out loud, and he was talking about how he painted or drew Kalava on
Mm.
the cave wall, and that he was out outcast for, or he was
Hmm.
exiled uh,
Yeah.
for that kind of capturing her likeness in one place. And then he wonders if I think he wonders if she was not in the ritual because she was already immortal because he had
Had
came
immortalized
into
her
it. Sorry.
because he had immortalized her.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, the
And
equivalent of
I love
Mona
that.
Lisa or
Yeah.
yeah.
I there's so I work with the Seminole tribe,
Hmm.
and there's definitely caution sometimes whenever uh, I do interviews with them and with the community, and there's sometimes caution with capturing someone's
Oh yeah.
likeness on video,
Oh yeah.
and the ability of that video to live on after a
Mhm.
person's passed away. And so Onrak talking about that and the book really kind of, it was like, oh wow, this is, 6 years ago when I read that scene, I wasn't thinking of or I didn't have as much, I guess, context
Yeah.
to kind of think
Yeah,
about.
there's I mean, just anthropologically, there's an extraordinarily complex relationship between ethnography and the belief systems of the people being studied. And quite often that, it may be sort of um, not too unfamiliar to the viewers that this notion of um, certainly some belief systems, including the notion that if a picture is taken of you, a part of your soul is taken. Um, and so I remember when I was studying, well, actually, when I was doing work related to rock art in North America, um, and the professor who was really trying to push me in that direction. He wanted me to do a master's studying rock art. Um, so we would have conversations regarding this. And one of the things he wanted me to sort of follow up on was two things. One was the visual images of horses, but the other one was the absence of anthropomorphic forms, so that even when a figure is drawn, a human figure, it is not drawn with the same attention to anatomy and detail that the animals being hunted or the animals being watched or looked at have been drawn. And it was like there was this um, some kind of a fundamental difference between portraying a fellow human versus portraying an animal. And there's no answers to it. It's very curious. It's an odd disconnect that's going on the rock walls all over Europe and everywhere else in Africa. And so when you see human forms, they are really um, their details are they're kind of reduced. And the physiology doesn't make sense. Quite often the arms are too long, the elbows, are in the wrong place or too far down the limbs, the legs are shortened or they're elongated. There's all kinds of strange alterations going on there that are not in keeping with the physiology that's being rendered. So question is why, right? Why is that? Is there was there a cultural prohibition, a taboo against accurately representing fellow human beings? And that's sort of it was that question that became sort of the genesis for that storyline relating to the Talana Mass. It came out of rock art, so interestingly enough. Um, and so I just, with the fantasy world, okay, well let's take that belief system and push it a little bit further and make the fear of a soul being trapped and made immortal by being represented on basically a surface that doesn't break down or doesn't disappear on you. You know, what if that kind of illustration actually creates that immortality in the one being illustrated, and where does the blame lie? And you know, if there is going to be blame, right? So somebody, you know, Onrak falling in love with Kalaba and illustrating her without her permission, and then, you know, in a sense curses her with immortality. It's interesting. Yeah, it's just
Okay.
fun to play with.
I'm and I'm just now kind of putting together. I know other fans may have put this together right away when they read the books the first time, but that Troll is he's very familiar with someone being immortal, and now all of a sudden his traveling companion is a mass
Mm-hmm.
who obviously doesn't seem to. It's so many years, so many like millennia distant that maybe the same. Onrak's not going to feel the same way about being immortal that Troll's
No.
brother Roulette does
Yeah,
after he
they're the opposite ends of, yeah,
right, right.
for sure.
So yeah, I hadn't thought about that before, but oh yeah, I love that yeah.
Yeah. And of course, throughout the narrative, as you know, where where Onrek's storyline goes, brings him back to mortality.
Right, right.
So yeah.
Maybe on that point, and kind of picking up some threads you mentioned earlier, uh, I do get this. There's often an optimism with death
Hmm.
in these books,
Hmm.
or at least an optimism regarding the peace that people can find.
Hmm.
And sometimes that's they're taken through Hood's gaze and that's it, enough said. Sometimes it's in like the uh, I might mess up the name of it, the refugium, and
Refugium? Yeah.
yeah, the refugium, and is that in the seventh book? I think is where, um,
Hmm.
yeah, and like Onrak finds, or yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess.
It's but a lot of our world's belief systems certainly offer um a version of paradise of some kind, or a happy hunting ground, or you know, a Garden of Eden, or whatever. Um, some return to a state of some kind of return to a state of balance, and peace. So yeah, I mean, that stuff's going to be explored in these books. I mean, because you know, anthropologists, this is what we do, right? So it's just a fictional version of this kind of approach. Um, but at the same time, there's a lot of elaborations on that belief system whereby um, an incomplete soul, if you will, does not get all the way there. And so there need to be um, interim uh, placeholders, if you will, for these things. And so I think the opening to Toll the Hounds, the prologue, is one of those placeholders.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I, I I I did want sort of that kind of, like, it's not binary, it's not one or the other. There can be places in between, which then allows for, at least uh, in the physics of that world, there allows for uh, the presence of ghosts and spirits, because they are in a sense in the intermediary state, um, between moving fully into the light and being in this world. Yeah,
Uh,
it's basically the Malazan stuff. Because of all the cultures we're writing about, we can cover as many belief systems as we can, you know, as we are aware of, and then we'll invent other ones. And but yeah.
was there ever I get in the gaming that you guys did? were there characters that you brought back to life? Like, did your characters die frequently, or were there any that were like, oh no, you're
Well,
too
I mean, it's
powerful?
gaming. It's gaming.
Okay,
So yeah, resurrection was not uncommon, right?
sure.
There was no way we were gonna, employ it that often. You do that in games because you have to, basically.
Right.
Well, you don't have to, but it's a drag to roll up new characters all the time. Um, Although we did have characters die off, definitely, and you put those characters away. Whether they're ones we've rolled up or NPCs, they're out of the picture at that point. So yeah, we did have characters die, but yeah, there were some major characters that where their death was it was not the ending that satisfied either one of us.
Okay.
And so, we would alter the storyline to adjust and to make it a little bit better. Now,
Uh,
some of that
w-
stuff I can't touch on because um, it relates directly to one of Cam's novels and
oh,
uh, relates also to a long-standing reader debate regarding the resurrection of a particular character or
oh,
two characters.
interesting. Okay.
But yeah, I can't go into any more detail than that. But um, yeah, we did have some major characters die off on us. Having said that, me killing Whiskey Jack in the third book was not part of any game.
Okay.
And I know Cam was a bit miffed, but that was one of his characters. So,
Okay.
yeah, but then I told him he can kill off, any of my characters if he
Did
wants.
he? Or,
Did he? Um, I don't know if he has, apart from this one I'm talking about. But that
oh,
was that was game. That was game. So he was holding to the game,
okay.
the truth, the veracity of the game. At least on his first drafts. We had to alter it later.
Okay.
We discussed it. Yeah.
Um, well, so a little bit ago you touched on Toll the Hounds. I was wondering if you'd like to talk about the end of that book, as that's kind of really where Hood steps, like really
Mm.
steps into things, into swords, into whatever. And yeah, I'm just curious what the decision was like to bring Hood, I guess, into this plan with all of these powerful individuals and to get him into the sword and for him to have his army with him and kind of, I mean, that scene reads very much to me like a this is the ultimate kind of epic version of what we saw at the end of House of Chains, but this is just in a very different setting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a whole different level. Yeah.
more familiar faces too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it gave them, some final moments on stage, as it were.
Mhm.
So they had been pulled away, but they were back. And then we had all the characters who were trapped in the sword as well. So you bring them, right, bring them in. But the idea of bringing Hood onto the streets of Darujistan was the thing I was actually writing towards more than what happens with Hood and Rake and all the rest. I think like I knew that was going to happen, but the thing I was really looking forward to was having Hood step onto the cobbles of the streets of Darujistan. And I think one, it was a fun writing exercise to just create all these mini stories as he makes his way down the street. It was a lot of fun, but also to underscore, I think, one of the more heavier themes of that story that relates more to the real world, which is that death is freaking random, um, and it's there's no rhyme or reason for all of this stuff. You can look at disease as being cause and death the effect, but the question of who gets the disease it seems to be entirely random.
Right.
Yeah, it's I guess genetic proclivities. I don't know, but so Hood or death appearing on the streets then just sort of personifies that randomness, that his mere presence creates all of this um, domino effect in rooms and bedrooms and living rooms, throughout, as he passes by. So for me, that was kind of one of those, um, I guess, one of those scenes that, in my mind at least, was one of the highlight scenes. But it wasn't one that was going to be full of, centralized action, that had great reverberations. It was the other way around. It was that you had all these ancillary tragic events occurring all around that did not have any reverberations into the story world in any sense. And I mean, most of death is that, right? So if you've ever walked a cemetery or a burial ground, and I remember in Saskatchewan walking one that had blown out, so it was revealing bones in the backyard of an abandoned farm, and these were 4,000, 5,000 year old burials. What do we know about them? We know nothing, right? No names, no history, no story. We know nothing of their lives, and that's 99.99% of the history of humanity. And all of that was sort of in my mind with Hood's walk down the street.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm.
And then, so I guess, so Hood walks down the street. It's killed by, or killed, taken into Dragnipur by Rake. And then he
Oh
gets
yeah,
to,
yeah. That his line. I've reconsidered.
right.
I made that up at the spot, right on the spot.
Okay.
Just I thought that'd
I,
be really funny.
yeah,
I have
I
no
was
idea what
gonna
he was
say,
reconsidering, but he never got to finish. So
I'd always assumed he was just messing with Rake. I don't know if
that too.
that's
It's a good possibility. Yeah, it was fun.
um but yeah, because it seems, at least it seemed pretty clear once he got in the sword, when he's speaking with Draconis, he always intended to
Oh
to
yeah,
be there, and yeah, he had his legions marching.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, kind of with that reunion with Draconis, that scene, I've gone back and just specifically reread that since reading the first, specifically since reading Forge of Darkness. I
Hmm.
then went and reread when they get back, or see each other again in Toll the Hounds. Um, I, yeah, I'm curious, how much of the prequels did you have had you started working on when you wrote Hood and Draconis meeting up?
Um,
Toll the
I
Hounds?
was certainly thinking about it in the writing of Toll the Hounds
Okay,
because we had all the Enda Salan
right.
memories, and so um, in order for those scenes to, I guess, make sense to me, I needed to really start building up that backstory, and that sort of led me to the idea that it would be quite interesting to set something at that time period. Um, so, I mean, the thing with Draconis is a lot like, say Tavor, a very constrained character. Um, we don't get that point of view very often. And so, the interactions they have, with characters of old, I certainly had to bear that in mind, that um, this is not our first meeting, and there were going to be previous meetings that will appear in the prequels. Um, so it was more of a challenge of, when I got to writing Forge of Darkness, to make sure that what I wrote in terms of their interaction was consistent with what we saw in Toll the Hounds.
Great, great. Um, and with Kharkanas, I guess they're, I don't want to call it not a project, a mission, or what Draconis tasks the Errant and Setralath to
Did you
do.
laugh?
Yeah, with, and then that they do that by killing Hood's wife, that whole thing, and then that of course motivates Hood to wage a war against death.
Hmm.
Again, I know you're working on the
Mhm.
Walk in Shadow, so I don't want to pry too much, but um, I just, I mean, it's such an ambitious, it's almost, I mean, it's a ridiculous kind of claim to say, oh, I'm going to wage war against death, unless
Yeah,
maybe you're a jagged. Um, but yeah, I would just love to hear more of your thoughts on that idea.
that's why I liked it. I mean, the Jagut by that point, in terms of their cultural characteristics, their racial characteristics, if you will, species characteristics, are have been displayed and shown to be audacious beyond belief. Um, but also their ability to um, dismantle their own belief systems is also part of the comedic aspects of them as individuals. So they're incapable, if you will, of taking anything seriously or too seriously. And so, I mean, the question that then arises is the death of Hood's wife sufficient cause for him to declare war upon death? And um, maybe the reader hasn't got that question yet, but it's going to come up in the third book for sure. Um, and so then you have to ask, well, what else is involved here? And I think for me, it was that notion of it being so audacious, so much a railing against perceived rules of reality, um, that nobody but a Jagut could actually, call forth a war upon death. And then, of course, it opens up the existential, dilemma of how on earth is that, um, envisaged? How is it personified? How do you actually create a war upon death? And of course, I would say that the Jagged answer would be that is the mere act of living is a war upon death. It's one you're going to lose, but
Right.
we'll still fight it. So.
And it also his kind of call to arms against death. All of these other people pick up the idea and say,
Mhm.
"Oh, that might actually, at least that's worth fighting
Yeah,
for."
yeah. I think it's more a case of they love the absurdity of it,
Uh-huh.
um, and understand, from the very beginning that even if they can, even if they can find a battlefield, um, they're doomed to lose, right? There's no way they can win.
Right.
And it would probably be a very bad thing if they did.
Right.
So, and that's where, Coria, Delath, and Erethan have that, you know, they both sort of are arguing on the opposite sides of that. And that made sense. It makes a lot more sense once everything else falls into place, but
Okay.
we can't do that yet.
Sure. Um, maybe sticking with Kharkanas,
Mhm.
would you like to talk about envy, spite, and malice at all? And
I don't know.
if
What would you like to talk about them with
I
respect?
think maybe just their sort of callous attitude towards violence and cruelty and murder and uh,
Well, they're sociopaths, all
right.
three of them, right? So I think in some ways it's almost that notion of, if granted immortality at too young an age, um, it can twist the individual to complete disregard of the value of life versus death. It makes it's not relevant to them, um, and hence the world around them. It just becomes something in which they can manipulate as best they can, for their own personal purposes. No, they're just absolutely batshit crazy. And I
Would
mean, and that can be fun to write as well, right? Uh, it's intended as a kind of uh, a dark comedy. They're what they do with Malice and all the rest, and Malice's return, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, and that, I mean, that has
Kind of
definitely.
Blood Simple. Have you ever seen the film Blood Simple? It's a lot like Blood Simple.
No, I haven't. Is I
Uh,
That's on. Is that a Coen Brothers movie?
yeah, it
Okay,
sure is.
it's on like my list of theirs that I haven't gotten to, but yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. The ending's phenomenal. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the spite, envy, malice stuff definitely plays like a horror comedy,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
it reads that way.
yeah,
I think definitely.
yeah.
And then spite and envy, at at least we see them later on in Malazan. I'm not sure. I can't remember if there's more like explicit like confirmation of Malice being someone that is around or that we know. Um,
Um, Not that I'm aware of.
okay, okay,
Um, but again, you'll get more of that from the third
okay.
book, Walking
Yeah,
Shadow.
yeah, yeah. I don't want to. Yeah. But with spite and envy, then would you say so many thousands of years in the future they've learned anything?
No,
Okay.
no. I mean, Envy was written up by Cam as an NPC, and when I was running Rake and Kaladin Brood and Queen of Dreams were my three characters, and Envy was just a foil, a brilliant foil. And Cam really, really played her to the hilt. It was fantastic gaming. Um, and yeah, she did have a role in the wresting of Dragnipur from Draconis. Um, a fairly neutral role, but it was a role. Could never tell sort of what her intentions were, what her desires were. And like I say, it was brilliantly played. So I was a little bit nervous to sort of introduce Envy, to make sure I could get her voice and her blasé indifference to almost everything around her. So uh, yeah, Envy, and then I think Spite was a later invention. I don't recall her being any part of the gaming stuff. And then I thought, okay, well, Spite is certainly in keeping, and Malice is certainly in keeping. And so it's one of those cases where the naming convention um, does not does not in any way disguise their nature. It goes the opposite way. It just says, just yeah, big waving flag, big signpost. Yeah, this is what we're looking at.
When you introduce any of these characters from the gaming, how much goes into considering what group that you're bringing them into, and like who's going to play off of them well, or like who are they surrounded by?
Um, I don't know. I knew for Envy, I mean, talk was sort of left hanging there, and so I need to bring him back. And then I think just on the fly, I threw Tool down there, because I thought it was really amusing to have this. You got your sort of classic Conan style image of some old warrior corpse leaning up against a boulder or a tree or something, just reduced to skeletons. But then to have that actually be animate and it be one of the characters of the story, I thought was a lot of fun. The idea of just sort of a Talana Mass having pretty much lived forever is why wouldn't they just sit and not move for 6 7 years or whatever.
Right.
um what else are you going to do? So I just thought it was a lot of fun. And I don't know, I think Envy again may have been thrown in there just on the fly, just to, like you say, to sort of create some. I knew I was going to bring in the Segula, because that idea of a three man army of retribution really amused me. So and then I guess Envy just became their keeper, and that turned out to be a lot of fun because it creates a lot of frisson, with those characters. Tool is, Tool then ends up, in terms of his one great skill, of course, is with the sword, and then he's counterpointed by Mok and the other Segula. And then you got the playoff between, the sort of the sexual attraction that Talk is fighting with regarding Envy, for whom her sexual attraction to him is utterly indifferent, but it amuses her. And so there's that whole aspect of their relationship that's being played out. And it's I don't know, it's hard to explain, but sometimes you just sort of you create or you throw the characters in that will shed sparks in some fashion or another.
Right. Um, with Talk and Tool, I guess there's another kind of example where you have Tool, this immortal warrior who's lived forever, and then Talk, who goes through unbelievable suffering and torment, and then he's brought back in a different body, around the same time that Tool is.
Yeah,
made.
he keeps getting thrown back. He's like, the fish you keep catching and catch and release. You let it go and you catch it again the next day. Yeah, poor Talk.
Right. But yeah, no, I just that their kind of their friendship, it also has a lot to do, I guess, with death and life or life and death.
Yeah, they certainly have different attitudes towards it for sure. But the Talana Mass were basically a kind of creation where death was not relevant to their existence. And then once you've removed that, then you realize you've removed the entire emotional context of humanity. And so what are you left with? Well, you're left with the bones, right? So that's what they are. And that's why that scene in Memories of Ice is a turning point for the Talana Mass.
I don't necessarily want to go too far into Cam's territory here, but with the and again, I'll say another kind of spoiler warning here, but for Esslemont's books, with the Crimson Guard and I guess how similar their vows of immortality were to the Mass, or as we find that out, I'm curious. Did you and he like talk a lot about
No,
that?
no.
Okay.
And the cool thing is, you better put at the beginning of this, you better put spoilers for Cam stuff as well.
Okay, yeah.
So, no, I was unaware that from the very beginning, from the Return of the Crimson Guard, Cam had the trajectory of the Crimson Guard, that they were in a sense going to become the new Talana Mass, and I had no idea. And he's very good at keeping, holding his cards close to his chest and not giving things away. Probably a lot better than I am. So that was absolutely jaw-dropping when we got to those scenes, and I suddenly realized, of course, this is going to be happening on a sail, because this is where I left the Talana Mass, and this is where they're coming, and this is where they show up. And that, handing of the baton basically over was that was breathtaking. It's brilliant.
Yeah, right. I agree. I was, when I got to that, I was like, oh, of course.
Of
But
course,
yeah.
it's been happening all along, and we didn't even notice it. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's I think he's a subtle writer.
Yeah.
Yeah, doesn't give it
Um,
away.
um, oh, that there was something right on the tip of my tongue, but I totally lost it just then. Um,
Right.
I I guess I don't have too many more like specific like scene questions that I'd like to point out or anything. But is there anything else that you'd like to say about death in your books in general?
Um, Not really. I suspect that there's an undercurrent of um, a slowly evolving belief change in belief systems that are present in me personally, that then just sort of uh, trickles through the bedrock and drips out onto the Malazan stuff. Probably with me not being aware of it. And so that I think that's present, and I think it starts to really sort of gain definition in Toll the Hounds, because I was dealing with something on a personal level at the same time. So um, and the novel allowed me to explore these um, that great bitter handshake between the living and the dead, which is grief.
Mhm.
So and it seemed to be the only language that seems possible in our world. But in the Malazan world, we can bend a few of those rules, and that I found that personally put me a lot more peace, I think, with the whole scenario. So it's there is an evolution that's certainly going on there, and it manifests later on. I mean, in the books I've written since, and I could see that there's a progression there. That even in envelops Rejoice, the first contact novel. It's
Oh,
present there as well. So yeah, which is interesting, but it's only mildly interesting in retrospect, and probably only to me. So that's okay.
um, well, I guess with what you are working on now, kind of, I, maybe we can wrap up the video soon here. But are there any like updates or like writing progress things that you'd like to,
No, I've had to
or you're
sort of,
comfortable?
yeah, I've had to Forsaken. I reached a three-quarter point when realized that I was writing two novels, not one.
Okay.
Um, and so structurally, it was a mess. And so what I had to do was I had to step back and um, reorder basically everything I'd done up to this point. And then having reordered it, I realized I needed to start adding some bridging scenes and bridging chapters that could link them back up and make it a bit more of a cohesive storyline as opposed to two. So that's kind of what I'm hammering away at right now. And it's weird to be working on chapter 4, knowing I've got, I don't know, 17 chapters already written past that,
Gosh.
right? But that's kind of where I'm stuck. And it's okay. It's one of the things I'm discovering is the 10 books and even the two books of Kharkanas, um, they they've tackled the heavy stuff. Um, they carry all that weight. Um, and I don't feel inclined to repeat myself, um, even though I'm still in the Malazan world. So I basically had to um, redirect my focus. That um, there's an element to this. I think we saw even in The God Is Not Willing. There's a more of a comedic element, and yeah, and I'm fighting myself in the sense that I'm trying to keep that reined in. So because I don't know if I have the wherewithal to go for the heavy shit anymore, you know. I mean it plays out, yes, in The God Is Not Willing. It will play out to some extent in this book and certainly in the third one. But everything that's leading up to that is a little bit in a lighter vein, I think. And that's just how it's turning out.
I mean, it's some of the funniest Marines scenes that I read were in God Is Not Willing.
Well,
But the,
and yeah, but that continues in Forsaken with different Marines.
okay.
Um, I'm dealing now with, in fact, I was writing their scenes. I was finishing off the scene of them. Um, it's two female sappers, which is in itself, unusual because
Uh-huh.
the argument has always been that among the soldiers of the Malazan Marines is that uh, only men are stupid enough to actually become sappers, right? Women are not. So I've got these two women, and they don't even like each other, which makes it even more fun. So I'm having a great time writing them, but that's the problem. I have to sort of remind myself that no, I've got a novel to write here. I got to finish. I got to move on from these two, even though I'd like to hang around with them for the rest of the book. Maybe I'll do that at some point. I'll stick with two soldiers and just stay with them for an entire novel. That might be fun.
Yeah. Any updates? I know you had mentioned you were working on I don't know if it was a memoir or if it was a book on writing.
Yeah, on writing, yeah, I went through it, what I'd written a couple days ago, a few days ago. Um, it's pretty close. It needs the edit, and that timing is kind of outside my control.
Oh,
So I've got maybe another two chapters, or sections to write. Um, and then it's a question of assembling it all. But yeah, it's I mean it's what I've got, I think, is okay. I'll probably keep most of it. We'll see. Yeah.
well, thanks for kind of sharing those teases there at the
Sure.
end. Also, thank you so much for coming on and talking about, I guess, as it turns out, not such a bleak topic after all.
No, I don't think so. I don't think I don't think there's anything particularly bleak about it.
Right. All right. Thank you all for watching. Have a good one. Bye.
Yeah, take care. Bye bye.